Lucas had been driving for hours along the abandoned road, the sun long gone and darkness swallowing the world around him. His car's headlights barely pierced through the thick fog that clung to the road like a shroud. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, its signal lost in this forgotten stretch of asphalt. The road seemed endless, twisting in unnatural ways, as if it didn't want to lead him anywhere. Just as the anxiety began to set in, Lucas noticed a flicker of light in the distance, barely visible through the mist. His heart skipped a beat. There, standing eerily on the side of the road, was an old, decrepit hotel. Its sign, half broken and dangling from a rusted chain, spelled out the name, the hollow inn in faded letters. Something about it was profoundly wrong. The air grew colder, and a metallic taste clung to the back of his throat as if warning him to turn back. But despite every instinct screaming for him to leave, something pulled him towards the hotel. The building itself was a towering relic of another time, its once grand architecture now crumbling under the weight of decay. Windows were boarded up, but through the gaps, Lucas could swear he saw shadows moving inside. The front door, an enormous wooden slab, stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. He stepped closer, feeling the oppressive atmosphere wrap around him like a vice. Every sound seemed magnified. The crunch of his shoes on the gravel, the rustling of dead leaves, and the faint whisper of the wind. But there was something else too, something beneath those natural noises, a faint murmuring that seemed to come from within the hotel itself. It was as if the building was alive. Lucas paused at the entrance, his heart hammering in his chest. The door opened wider on its own with a slow, agonizing creak, revealing the darkness within. Swallowing hard, he stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of mildew and something more pungent, like rotting flesh. The dim light from the moon barely penetrated the interior, casting long, distorted shadows across the once elegant lobby. A grand chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dull and covered in dust, but every so often they would catch a glint of light, reflecting like dead eyes watching him. As Lucas moved deeper into the room, his footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the space was far larger than it appeared. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. He could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes following his every movement. Then, out of the corner of his eye, something shifted. He turned sharply, but there was nothing there. The lobby seemed empty, yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger, more suffocating. The shadows seemed to dance, twisting and curling in the corners, as if something unseen was moving just beyond his sight. Lucas's breath quickened. He could hear it now, soft footsteps, barely audible but unmistakable, coming from the hallway ahead. The sound was getting closer, slow and deliberate, like something was creeping towards him, waiting for him to notice. He took a step back, the urge to flee overwhelming. But just as he turned towards the exit, the door he had entered through slammed shut with a deafening bang. Lucas froze. The room was silent now, the air thick with dread. His pulse pounded in his ears, and every instinct told him he wasn't alone. Desperately, he scanned the room again, but this time, in the dim reflection of the cracked mirror behind a reception desk, he saw it. A figure, standing still in the shadows, just barely visible. Its form was wrong, too tall, too thin, and hunched like it didn't belong in this world. Before he could fully comprehend what he was seeing, the figure moved, vanishing into the darkness. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. His heart raced, each beat like a drum echoing in the silent, oppressive air. He was trapped in a hotel now, surrounded by something far older and more malevolent than he could imagine. The air seemed to hum with a sinister energy, and Lucas knew, deep down, that whatever was in this place had been waiting for him. As Lucas ventured deeper into the hotel, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to thicken, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. The flickering lights cast erratic shadows along the walls, distorting the shapes of the furniture and twisting reality itself. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the eerie silence, and with every step, a strange familiarity crept over him. He felt like he had been here before, but that was impossible, wasn't it? The sensation gnawed at the edges of his mind, tugging at memories buried long ago. His heart raced as he approached the end of a long, dimly lit corridor, where a peculiar door caught his eye. Its paint was peeling, but carved into the wood was a symbol he vaguely recognized. He hesitated before reaching for the handle, his mind racing with unease. As his fingers touched the cold brass, a jolt of electricity shot through his body, sending a flood of disjointed images into his mind. A room, a woman's voice, laughter, and then darkness. He shook his head, trying to shake off the strange vision, but the unease lingered. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room that felt oddly preserved, untouched by the decay of the rest of the hotel. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, and an unsettling quietness filled the space. At the center of the room was a small wooden table, and on it sat an object that made Lucas's blood run cold, a toy truck. It was small and worn, the paint chipped from years of neglect, but there was no mistaking it. Lucas recognized it instantly. It was his, from his childhood. He hadn't seen it in decades, yet here it was, sitting in the middle of this forgotten place. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch it, the memories flooding back all at once. He had lost the truck when he was 7, during a family vacation, but not just any vacation. His family had stayed at a hotel eerily similar to this one. He remembered waking up one night, the sound of whispers filling his room, but when he had tried to find his parents, the hotel corridors had stretched endlessly, trapping him in a maze of nightmares. Lucas's throat tightened as he tried to comprehend how this toy could possibly be here, in a place he hadn't set foot in for so long. His mind raced with a million possibilities, none of them comforting. Had he been here before? Had his memory of that vacation been distorted, suppressed by fear? The more he thought about it, the more fragmented his recollections became. He remembered being lost, crying out for his parents, but what had happened after? His childhood memories, once clear, were now muddled, tinged with an inexplicable darkness. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Lucas spun around, his pulse pounding in his ears, but the room was empty, except for a subtle sound that made his skin crawl. A soft melody, barely audible, drifted through the air. It was a lullaby, one he hadn't heard since he was a child. His mother used to sing it to him before bed, a soothing tune meant to keep nightmares at bay. But here, in this room, it felt wrong. The melody was distorted, echoing off the walls like a ghostly whisper. Lucas's heart pounded harder as the realization set in. This was the same lullaby he had heard that night, all those years ago, just before everything had gone dark. His breath quickened as the room seemed to close in around him. The walls felt too tight, the air too thick to breathe. As the lullaby grew louder, Lucas caught a glimpse of something in the mirror on the far side of the room. His reflection stared back at him, but something was off. The reflection didn't mimic his movements. It stood there, perfectly still, eyes wide with terror, as if watching something approach from behind him. Lucas's heart stopped. He spun around, but the room was empty. The toy truck, however, had moved. It now sat closer to the edge of the table, as if someone or something had pushed it. Terror gripped him, colder and more suffocating than ever before. The room wasn't just a relic of his past. It was a gateway, a trap that had been set for him all those years ago. Something had been waiting for him, and now it was calling him back, using his own memories as bait. Lucas felt the weight of the forgotten past bearing down on him, and he knew that whatever haunted this place had a connection to him, a connection that went deeper than he could understand. Lucas's heart raced as he stumbled down the winding halls of the hotel, disoriented and terrified. The building seemed to twist and shift around him, as if it were alive, its very architecture bending to trap him. His mind was a whirlpool of fear and confusion, every step echoing with the sensation of being hunted. Yet, it wasn't just the physical danger that stalked him now. Something deeper, something far more sinister, was at play. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the air thickened around him, suffocating with invisible hands. It was as if the hotel itself was testing him, pushing him towards some unseen horror. Then, as he turned a corner, he saw it. A door slightly ajar, glowing with a faint, sickly light. With trembling hands, Lucas pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room that seemed to pulsate with a strange energy, the walls almost vibrating with an unearthly hum. At the center of the room stood a figure, himself. Or rather, a younger version of himself, no older than 8 or 9, staring back at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Lucas froze, disbelief and terror swirling in his chest. This was impossible. His younger self shouldn't be here, couldn't be here. But the boy's expression was unmistakable. He was terrified, just as Lucas had been on that long-forgotten night years ago. The boy was trapped, just as he had been, and whatever force haunted this place had brought him back, dragging this fractured piece of his soul into the present. Lucas stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath his weight, his breath shallow as dread filled his veins. The room felt heavy with a presence he couldn't see, but could sense watching him, waiting. The younger Lucas trembled, looking up at him with pleading eyes. And then, from the shadows, a voice echoed. A voice that was not human, but a low, guttural whisper that filled the room like smoke. "You must choose," the voice hissed, each word dripping with malice. "To save the boy, you must give something in return." Lucas's stomach twisted with fear. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. "What? What do you want?" The shadows shifted, and a figure began to emerge from the darkness. A grotesque, twisted being, half hidden in the gloom. Its eyes gleamed with a cold, unnatural light, and its face was a distortion of human features, elongated and wrong. It loomed over the young boy, its form flickering in and out of the shadows like a nightmare barely held together by reality. "You must sacrifice a memory," the creature rasped, its voice like nails scraping against bone. "One of your most precious memories. Give it to me, and the boy will live." Lucas's mind raced, his thoughts a blur of panic and disbelief. A memory, a precious memory. He knew instinctively that this was no mere bargain. Whatever this entity was, it fed on something far more valuable than just memories. It wanted a piece of his soul, the very essence of who he was. And yet, the boy, his younger self, was staring at him with those same frightened eyes, desperate for salvation. The boy represented more than just a fragment of the past. He was everything Lucas had buried, every fear and trauma he had locked away, now resurfacing in the most terrifying way. But which memory could he give? The entity seemed to sense his hesitation and crept closer, its long, twisted fingers reaching out as if to caress the very air around him. Lucas's breath hitched as he realized the weight of the decision he faced. The creature's whisper became louder, almost seductive, urging him to act. "The memory of your mother's last smile," it hissed, "or the day you first felt true love. Choose, and the boy will be saved." Terror gripped him. He couldn't bear the thought of losing either memory. The warmth of his mother's final, gentle smile before she passed had been his anchor in the darkest times of his life. It was a memory that gave him strength, that reminded him of love and kindness in a world often devoid of it. And then the memory of his first love, his first real connection to another human being, was equally precious. That feeling of safety, of belonging, of being seen. It had shaped him, formed the very core of his heart. Sweat dripped from Lucas's brow as he stared at the boy, knowing he couldn't just let him, himself, suffer. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a crushing burden. The entity leaned in closer, its presence suffocating, the stench of decay filling the room. "Time is running out," it rasped, and the younger Lucas whimpered, his small frame shaking with fear. In that moment, Lucas realized that this choice was more than just a simple sacrifice. It was a trap. The entity wanted to break him, to take something irreplaceable from him, a part of his soul that he could never reclaim. He looked at the boy, then at the looming figure, and felt the terror rise like bile in his throat. He had to decide, but how could he give up such a crucial part of himself? Finally, with shaking hands, Lucas whispered, "I'll give you the memory of my mother's smile." The entity paused, its twisted face contorting into something resembling a grin. "Very well." A wave of cold swept over Lucas as the memory was torn from his mind. It was like having a piece of his heart ripped away, leaving an aching void in its place. He felt hollow, as if part of his very identity had been erased. The younger boy vanished, dissolving into the shadows. Lucas fell to his knees, gasping for breath, tears streaming down his face. He had made the choice, but at what cost? The room was silent now, the entity gone. But Lucas knew the truth. The hotel wasn't done with him yet. Lucas sat on the cold, dusty floor of the hotel, his body trembling from the impossible choice he had just made. His mind felt fractured, the memory of his mother's smile now nothing more than an empty void in his heart. The pain of that loss echoed through his soul, but something far worse began to take hold. The air around him thickened, growing colder, denser. The shadows that clung to the corners of the room seemed to stretch and crawl toward him, moving with a life of their own. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in the corner of his eye, a shiver down his spine. But soon it became unmistakable. The hotel was alive, and it was watching him. The walls seemed to pulse, a faint, rhythmic throb like the slow, steady beat of a dying heart. The faint glow from the room's single light bulb flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the cracked walls. And then, from somewhere deep within the building, a soft sound emerged, a whisper. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through dry leaves, but it grew louder, more distinct, as if something was speaking directly into Lucas's mind. His breath caught in his throat. He turned, scanning the room for any sign of movement, but the shadows remained still. Yet the whispering continued, faint and unintelligible, like the murmuring of voices just beyond the threshold of reality. It was as if the very walls were trying to speak to him, conveying a message that hovered just out of reach, tantalizingly close, but maddeningly elusive. Lucas pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside him now, burrowing into his mind. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if they were solidifying into something more tangible. They slithered along the floor, creeping toward him with a sinister grace. Lucas felt a chill crawl down his spine as the room grew colder, the air heavy with the scent of decay. He stood up, his legs shaking, and backed away from the shadows, but no matter where he moved, they followed. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, sentient, reaching out to claim him. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and Lucas could finally make out fragments of words. "Come closer. Remember, you cannot escape." The voice was neither male nor female, but something ancient, something that had existed long before him. It carried the weight of centuries, as if the very foundation of the hotel was built upon the suffering and fear of those who had come before. Every step Lucas took seemed to provoke the shadows, and they began to rise, taking on strange, twisted forms, half human, half monster. Faceless figures loomed just out of reach, their movements unnatural, jerking like puppets controlled by invisible strings. Lucas stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. His vision blurred as the walls of the hotel seemed to close in on him, twisting and distorting like a funhouse nightmare. The floor beneath him creaked and groaned, as though something immense and malevolent stirred beneath the surface. A cold, clammy hand brushed against his arm, but when he turned, there was nothing there, just the flickering shadows that danced and twisted in the dim light. Panic surged through him as the whispering intensified, the voices now overlapping, echoing through his skull. They spoke of pain, of betrayal, of horrors too vast and incomprehensible for his mind to grasp. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, the hotel warping his perception, twisting his thoughts until he could no longer trust his own senses. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, as if the entire building was alive, and Lucas was trapped inside its rotting carcass. Suddenly, the shadows began to move with purpose, slithering along the floor and walls, converging in the center of the room. They coalesced into a shape, tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in darkness. Its form was hazy, as if it existed halfway between this world and another, a flickering silhouette that exuded an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure stood silently, watching Lucas with eyes that weren't there, yet he could feel its gaze piercing through him, cold and relentless. The whispers became a chorus, voices speaking in unison now, urging him to step closer, to surrender to the darkness. "You are one of us now," they hissed, the words filling his mind like poison. "You cannot leave. You never left." Lucas's blood ran cold as he realized what they meant. The hotel wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a living entity that fed on fear, on the souls of those who wandered inside. It had been waiting for him all this time, calling him back to the darkness he had escaped as a child. The shadows weren't just illusions. They were the remnants of those who had been consumed by the hotel, their souls twisted and broken, forever trapped within its walls. Desperation clawed at him as he backed away from the shadowy figure, his body trembling with fear. But no matter how far he moved, the figure remained just out of reach, always watching, always waiting. The air grew thick with the scent of rot, and Lucas could hear something moving beneath the floorboards, a low, slithering sound that sent chills up his spine. The whispers urged him to surrender, to let go of the fear, to become one with the darkness. Lucas clenched his fists, his breath ragged as he fought to hold onto his sanity. The shadows pressed closer, suffocating him with their weight, their cold tendrils wrapping around his mind. He had to escape, but the hotel was alive, and it would not let him go without a fight. Lucas's mind was unraveling, and he knew it. The boundaries between reality and nightmare had dissolved. The oppressive air of the hotel clung to his skin like a wet shroud, and the shadows seemed to seep into his very thoughts. He could no longer trust his senses, his eyes, his ears, even the feel of the ground beneath his feet. All of it was betraying him. Each step he took felt like it led him deeper into the labyrinth of his own fears, a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. Every wall he touched pulsed like flesh. Every door he opened led him back to the same hallways. Time was slipping through his fingers, and then came the visions. At first, they were fleeting. A blur in the corner of his eye, the faint sound of laughter, or the flash of movement just outside his line of sight. But soon they became vivid, tangible horrors that crawled out of the shadows and took shape before his eyes. Lucas found himself in the lobby once more, only now it was not empty. The chandelier, which had previously been dull and lifeless, now blazed with a sickly yellow light. The lobby was filled with people, guests, families, all seemingly normal at first glance. But their faces, they were wrong. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths stretched into unnatural grins that didn't reach their vacant, lifeless eyes. A mother sat in the corner, singing a lullaby to a baby cradled in her arms, but the baby wasn't moving. Its tiny form was limp, pale, and cold. Across the room, a man in a torn suit stared directly at Lucas, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. His neck had been broken, yet he smiled, teeth stained red. These weren't just ghosts or hallucinations. They were manifestations of every fear Lucas had ever harbored, twisted into grotesque parodies of life. They filled the room, silent and still, watching him with those empty, dead eyes. Lucas's heart thundered in his chest as he backed away, but no matter where he turned, they were there, standing in every corner, every shadow. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, they began to move, slowly, methodically. The figures advanced toward him, their smiles widening unnaturally, their limbs jerking with spasms of unnatural movement. The mother's lullaby grew louder, the tune distorted and warped, becoming something sinister and mocking. The man with the broken neck was closer now, his eyes boring into Lucas, his smile splitting his face unnaturally wide. Lucas tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His body refused to move, frozen in place as the grotesque figures closed in on him. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, and it gripped his mind like a vice, clouding every rational thought. As the figures reached out for him, their hands cold and decayed, Lucas's vision blurred, and he found himself falling deeper into the abyss of his own terror. He landed in a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever, the walls undulating like they were breathing. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, shifting with every step. Lucas's breaths came in ragged gasps, his pulse thundering in his ears. His hands shook uncontrollably as he wiped the sweat from his brow. But it wasn't sweat, it was blood. His hands were slick with it, crimson and warm, though he had no idea how it got there. His eyes widened as he stared down at his trembling hands, the blood seeming to pulse in rhythm with his racing heart. Then came the voice, slithering into his mind like serpent. "It's not real, unless you believe it is," it whispered, sending a chill down his spine. "Your fear is the key. You've seen it before, haven't you? In your dreams, in your nightmares." The voice was calm, almost soothing, but laced with a malevolent undertone. Lucas staggered forward, desperate to escape the voice, but it followed him, echoing from the walls, from the floor, from inside his own skull. "What are you afraid of, Lucas?" it asked, taunting him. His vision began to swim, and the hallway twisted, contorting into impossible angles. Doors appeared along the walls, each one slightly ajar, the sound of distant weeping and whispering seeping through the cracks. "You've been here before," the voice continued. "This is your fear, your creation. Everything you've ever been afraid of is here, waiting for you." Suddenly, one of the doors slammed open, revealing a scene from his past. It was his childhood bedroom, the room where he had spent so many nights, frozen in fear as shadows crept across the walls. But this wasn't a memory. This was something else. The shadows in the room were alive, writhing and shifting like creatures made of pure darkness. They reached out for him, their forms dripping with malice and hunger. Lucas took a step back, his breath hitching as the terror began to consume him. "Face it," the voice hissed, "or be consumed by it." The shadows slithered toward him, their tendrils reaching out to wrap around his ankles, pulling him into the nightmare he had tried to forget. Lucas struggled, his hands clawing at the walls, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank into the darkness. His mind was fracturing, the line between reality and hallucination dissolving into a chaos of terror. Suddenly, everything stopped. The shadows receded, and Lucas was left standing in a dark, empty void. The voice spoke again, now louder, more insistent. "Embrace your fear, or let it destroy you." Before him, a mirror materialized out of the darkness. In the reflection, Lucas saw himself, but not as he was. His reflection was twisted, gaunt, its eyes hollow and devoid of life, much like the figures from the lobby. His reflection smiled, a cruel, knowing smile that sent a wave of dread through his entire body. "What are you willing to sacrifice to escape?" the voice asked. Lucas stared at the mirror, his breath shallow, his mind racing. He knew what the hotel wanted. It didn't just feed on fear. It fed on the surrender to fear. It wanted him to give in, to let the terror consume him completely. But deep down, Lucas knew that if he did, there would be no escape. He would become just like the others, the empty-eyed figures trapped in the hotel's web. With a trembling hand, Lucas reached out toward the mirror. His reflection smiled wider, its eyes gleaming with malice. The fear gripped him tighter, whispering that there was no other way, that this was his only chance to escape. But something inside him resisted, a small spark of defiance that refused to let the hotel win. He took a deep breath, pulling his hand back from the mirror. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. "I won't let you take me." The reflection snarled, and the voice shrieked in rage, the hotel trembling around him. The shadows closed in once more, but this time Lucas didn't run. He stood his ground, even as the darkness swallowed him whole. Lucas stood frozen in the void, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a leaden blanket. The hotel had twisted and tortured his mind, pulling at every thread of fear and doubt until he was hanging by a fraying thread. But now, as the darkness closed in on him from every side, he could sense something deeper. The malevolent presence that had haunted his every step since he first entered the hotel was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was here. It had been waiting for him all along. And now, it was time for the final confrontation. The air grew thick with an oppressive heat, as though the walls of the hotel were burning with an invisible fire. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the void around him shifted, slowly taking form. Lucas blinked, his vision hazy, and realized he was no longer standing in the empty void. He was back in the grand lobby, but this time it was different. The walls were cracked and crumbling, black mold creeping across the once elegant decor, and the chandelier overhead was shattered, its broken glass glittering like shards of ice on the floor. The entire hotel seemed to be rotting away, decaying before his eyes. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The entity. It was no longer lurking in the shadows, but standing before him, fully revealed. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, its body twisted and elongated in ways that defied human anatomy. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, gray and mottled, with patches of darkness seeping through, like ink spreading beneath paper. Its face was a grotesque mask, a twisted mockery of human features, with empty eye sockets that seemed to bore into Lucas's soul. It had no mouth, but Lucas could feel it smiling, a malevolent grin that radiated a sense of doom. The temperature dropped sharply, and Lucas could see his breath fogging in the frigid air. The hotel creaked and groaned around him, as if it were alive, feeding off the tension in the room. The entity stepped closer, its long, bony fingers reaching out toward him, and Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like the weight of the entire universe was pressing down on him. He wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare, but his legs refused to move. He was trapped, just as the hotel wanted. The entity spoke, though its mouth never moved. Its voice was everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the very fabric of the hotel, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down Lucas's spine. "You were always meant to return here," it hissed, the words dripping with malice. "You belong to me. You have always belonged to me." Lucas's mind raced, the memories of his childhood flooding back with terrifying clarity. This wasn't the first time he had encountered the hotel. He had been here before, as a child, though his mind had blocked out, repressed the memory of the horrors he had witnessed. The hotel had chosen him, marked him, and now it wanted to claim what was rightfully its own. But why? Why him? The entity seemed to sense his confusion and stepped closer still, its presence suffocating, like a black hole pulling everything into its center. "You were born in fear, shaped by it. Your fear is what gives me power," it continued, its voice echoing in Lucas's mind. "But fear is not enough. I need more. I need you." Lucas staggered back, his mind reeling from the revelation. The hotel wasn't just a haunted building. It was a living entity, a parasite that fed on fear and suffering, and he had been its chosen victim from the beginning. Every memory, every trauma, had led him back to this moment. The hotel had been pulling the strings all along, manipulating his life, and now it wanted him to make the ultimate sacrifice. The air around him grew thick with the scent of rot and decay, and Lucas could feel the walls closing in, the floor beneath him trembling as if the entire hotel was alive, breathing, waiting for his decision. The entity raised its hand, palm outstretched, and in it, Lucas saw something horrifying, a twisted, writhing mass of shadows, dark and pulsing with a malevolent energy. It was a part of the hotel itself, a fragment of its essence, and it was offering it to him. "Take it," the entity whispered, its voice like ice sliding down his spine. "Become one with the darkness. Accept your fear, and you will have the power to stop me, but you will never be the same." Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, as he stared at the writhing mass. The offer was clear: absorb part of the hotel's dark essence, gain the strength to confront the entity, but lose a piece of himself in the process. He knew that if he accepted, he would never be the same. The darkness would become a part of him, and he would be bound to the hotel forever. But if he refused, he might not survive. The hotel would consume him, and he would become one of the countless lost souls trapped within its walls. Time seemed to stretch out as Lucas stood there, the weight of the decision crushing him. The air buzzed with tension, and the entity loomed closer, its eyes, if it had eyes, locked on him, waiting. Lucas could feel the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind, threatening to swallow him whole. His hands trembled, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He had no choice. Slowly, hesitantly, Lucas reached out, his fingers brushing against the writhing mass of shadows. The moment he touched it, a jolt of cold, electric terror surged through him, and the darkness began to flow into his veins, spreading through his body like poison. Pain shot through him, white-hot and searing, as the essence of the hotel merged with his soul. He screamed, his body convulsing as the darkness consumed him, reshaping him, molding him into something new, something terrible. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Lucas fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the transformation. He could feel it inside him, the darkness, pulsing and writhing beneath his skin, a cold, alien presence that now lived within him. He had done it. He had accepted the hotel's offer. But at what cost? He looked up at the entity, and for the first time, he saw something in its hollow gaze: fear. The entity recoiled, its twisted form flickering and shifting as if it were no longer solid, no longer invincible. Lucas stood, his body still shaking, but now with a new strength, a power he had never known before. The darkness inside him surged, and with it came the realization that he could confront the entity. He could fight back. He could win. The final confrontation was at hand, and Lucas knew that whatever happened next, he would never be the same. The hotel had changed him, and the darkness was now a part of him. Lucas stood, his body trembling from the weight of the darkness, now coursing through his veins. The air around him felt thick and heavy, charged with an unearthly energy, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. His mind still reeled from the transformation, the cold, malevolent power pulsing beneath his skin, but with it came a clarity he had not felt before. He was no longer just a victim of the hotel. He had become something else, something stronger. The dark essence he had absorbed from the hotel had fused with his very being, and now he could feel the raw power surging through him. But this power came at a cost. The line between himself and the hotel had blurred. He was no longer just Lucas. He was part of the darkness. The entity loomed before him, its twisted, grotesque form flickering in and out of the shadows, no longer as solid as it once appeared. It had sensed the change in Lucas, and for the first time, Lucas saw something unexpected in the creature's hollow gaze: fear. The thing that had haunted him, manipulated him, now hesitated. The balance had shifted, but the hotel was not finished with him yet. The walls around them groaned, the floor shuddering beneath his feet as though the building itself was preparing for the final battle. The entity moved faster than before, its long, bony arms extending, sharp fingers cutting through the air like knives. Lucas barely had time to react. The shadows that had merged with him surged, instinctively reacting to the threat, and with a thought, they formed a barrier between him and the creature. The entity's claws collided with the dark shield, a screeching sound echoing through the space as sparks of energy flew from the impact. Lucas staggered back, the force of the collision sending a jolt of pain through his body. The darkness inside him recoiled, but held strong. He could feel it resisting the entity's power, but it was a struggle to maintain control. The hotel itself seemed to react to their battle. The walls cracked, bleeding a black, viscous fluid that dripped down like tar. The ceiling groaned, the chandelier swinging wildly above them as the floor buckled and heaved. The building was alive, reacting to the tension between Lucas and the entity, and it wanted a victor. Lucas felt it, the oppressive force of the hotel pushing against him, urging him to give in to the darkness completely. But he couldn't. Not yet. The entity hissed, a guttural sound that vibrated through the air, and lunged at him again. This time, Lucas was ready. He raised his hand, and the shadows moved with him, forming a tendril of darkness that lashed out at the creature. The tendril wrapped around the entity's arm, pulling it back with a force that surprised even Lucas. The creature howled, a shrill, inhuman sound that pierced through the air, and Lucas felt the surge of dark power intensify. He could feel the hotel's malevolent energy feeding him, urging him to destroy the entity, to tear it apart and take its place as the master of the darkness. But there was a catch. Lucas realized with a cold certainty that if he completely surrendered to this power, if he let the darkness consume him, he would become no different from the entity itself. The hotel didn't want him to defeat the creature out of victory. It wanted him to replace it, to become the new vessel for the evil that lurked within its walls. Lucas felt the weight of this revelation sink into his bones. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for his soul. The entity shrieked again, thrashing wildly as it tried to free itself from the grip of Lucas's shadows. Its eyes, empty and soulless, glowed with a fierce, unnatural light as it unleashed a torrent of energy. The force slammed into Lucas, sending him crashing into the wall with a bone-rattling impact. Pain shot through his body, but the darkness inside him responded, healing the wounds almost instantly, knitting his broken bones back together. But the cost of using the darkness was growing. Lucas could feel it taking a toll on him, draining his humanity with each passing moment. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand, the weight of the power threatening to overwhelm him. The hotel's whispers filled his mind, urging him to let go, to embrace the full extent of the darkness. It promised him power beyond imagining, an escape from fear, from pain. All he had to do was let go of the last shred of light within him. The entity loomed closer, its twisted form shifting and flickering as it approached. Lucas knew that this was the moment of truth, the final confrontation between them. He had to make a choice. He could unleash the full power of the darkness, destroy the entity, and end the nightmare. But in doing so, he would lose himself. Or he could fight to hold on to the last piece of his soul, even if it meant risking everything. With a deep breath, Lucas steadied himself. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the darkness pulsing within him, the weight of the hotel pressing down on him. And then, he made his choice. He wouldn't let the hotel win. He wouldn't become another twisted soul lost to the shadows. The entity lunged at him one last time, its claws outstretched, but Lucas moved faster. He raised his hands, and instead of calling on the darkness to strike back, he summoned it inward, pulling it away from the entity, away from the hotel. The shadows recoiled, retreating into his body, leaving the entity vulnerable for the first time. The creature howled in fury, but Lucas held firm, the darkness now under his control, no longer a weapon to be wielded, but a burden he would carry. The entity's form began to break apart, unraveling like smoke caught in a strong wind. It shrieked, a sound of pure rage and despair, as it dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the faint echo of its presence behind. The hotel shuddered, as though the very foundations were collapsing, but Lucas remained standing, breathing heavily, his mind clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The battle was over, but Lucas knew the cost. The darkness still lingered within him, a part of him now. He had defeated the entity, but he had not escaped unscathed. He was marked, bound to the hotel in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. The hotel had lost its monster, but in its place, it had gained a new prisoner. As the silence settled over the ruined lobby, Lucas walked toward the exit, his steps slow, deliberate. The hotel let him leave, for now, but he knew the truth. He had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. The darkness inside him whispered softly, a constant reminder that the hotel was never truly gone. It would wait, watching, biding its time, and one day, it would call him back. Lucas emerged from the decrepit hotel into the cold, moonlit night, his breath misting in the frigid air. His body ached from the confrontation, every muscle strained and sore, but the deeper pain was something far worse. The darkness, though diminished, still pulsed faintly inside him like a persistent echo, a reminder of the entity he had absorbed and the price he had paid for his survival. He stood for a moment, staring at the road stretching out before him, the once-forgotten highway that seemed to shift and bend under the weight of his gaze, as if it were still connected to the hotel's sinister will. The building behind him loomed large and silent now, its windows dark, its facade still crumbling and decayed, but something had changed. The air around it no longer thrummed with malevolent energy, yet Lucas could feel the presence of the hotel lingering just beneath the surface, like a predator lying in wait. He glanced back at the entrance, the doors now tightly shut, no longer inviting, but there was an unsettling sense that something was watching him, even though he was outside its walls. He took a deep breath, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and dread. He had survived the nightmarish ordeal, but the hotel had left its mark on him. The memories of what had happened inside still clung to his mind like shadows, twisting and distorting his thoughts. The entity was gone. He had destroyed it. But the hotel itself remained, and with it, the unsettling question of what it truly was. The road stretched out endlessly before him, a path back to reality, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel had more secrets, secrets that would haunt him forever. As he began to walk, the gravel crunching beneath his feet, a chill crept up his spine. The night was quiet, too quiet. The wind had died down, and even the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves and the distant call of animals, had vanished. It was as if the world around him was holding its breath, waiting. Lucas quickened his pace, eager to put as much distance between himself and the hotel as possible. But with every step, the weight of the darkness inside him grew heavier. It wasn't just the lingering power he had absorbed. It was the knowledge that the hotel was not truly defeated. It had let him leave, yes, but Lucas knew it was not the end. The road seemed longer than he remembered, twisting unnaturally, as if the hotel's influence still stretched beyond its walls. His thoughts were clouded with unease, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The moon, which had been full and bright when he first arrived, now seemed dimmer, as though the light was being swallowed by the darkness around him. Shadows clung to the edges of the road, moving just out of the corner of his eye, and he could hear faint whispers carried on the wind, soft, indistinct voices that chilled him to the core. He kept walking, refusing to look back, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Lucas's heart raced as a familiar voice rose above the others, clear and unmistakable. It was his own voice, younger, filled with the same fear he had felt as a child. "You can't leave," it said, the words wrapping around his mind like chains. "You never left. You're still here." He stopped dead in his tracks, his pulse pounding in his ears. His mouth went dry, and for a moment he couldn't move. The road in front of him seemed to shimmer, distorting like a mirage, and the edges of his vision blurred. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and with them came a realization that sent a wave of cold terror through his body. The hotel had not simply let him go. It had followed him. Lucas turned slowly, his heart sinking as he looked back the way he had come. The hotel was still there, just as it had been when he walked out. But the distance between him and the building had not changed. No matter how far he walked, the hotel remained, looming just behind him, like a shadow that could not be escaped. The road itself seemed to curl back on itself, looping endlessly in a twisted, nightmarish circle. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was still trapped. The hotel wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had ensnared him in its web, warping reality itself to keep him within its grasp. Desperation clawed at Lucas's throat as he tried to run, but with every step, the hotel remained just behind him, as though it were tethered to him, a part of his very existence. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him in a cacophony of voices, all his own, all telling him the same terrible truth. You are the hotel now. The darkness inside him pulsed with recognition, feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every passing moment. The hotel had not been destroyed. It had simply changed forms. It lived inside him now, a part of him, just as much as he was a part of it. Lucas stumbled to his knees, his body trembling as the full weight of his fate crashed down on him. He had thought he had won, that he had escaped the nightmare, but the truth was far worse. The hotel had marked him long ago, and no matter how far he ran, he would never truly be free. The entity he had fought was just one piece of the puzzle, a manifestation of the hotel's power, but the real terror was in the building itself, its walls, its foundations, its very essence. It was timeless, eternal, and it had chosen him as its next host. The ground beneath him seemed to ripple, the road warping and twisting as reality bent to the hotel's will. Lucas clutched his head, the whispers overwhelming his senses, and for a moment, he saw the truth. The hotel was everywhere. It existed beyond time and space, a place that defied logic and reason, feeding on the fear and suffering of those who wandered into its clutches. And now, it had him. With trembling hands, Lucas stood, his legs weak, his mind unraveling. The road stretched out before him, but he knew now that it led nowhere. He could walk for eternity, but he would never leave. The hotel was inside him, and he was bound to it forever. As the shadows crept closer, the whispers fading into a low, steady hum, Lucas took a deep breath. The night was still, the air thick with the weight of the unknown, and in the distance, the faint glow of the hotel's windows flickered, like eyes watching him from the darkness. He was a part of it now, and the mystery that had once terrified him would never let him go. It was the hotel's final trick, its last cruel joke. The terror was not in the escape. It was in the knowledge that there was no escape. The hotel would live on, and so would he, forever bound to the place where fear had no end. And somewhere, deep in shadows, the hotel whispered, waiting for its next victim to step through its doors.